Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Rebel Cause by E. Isherwood, narrated by Steve Marvel. Chapter 1. Long Island, New York. Ted and Emily had risen with the sun, snuck a bite from the cupboard of the stranger's apartment, then immediately jogged a couple of miles to escape the sprawl of New York City. He thought being on foot would reduce their chances of being seen by searching aircraft. However, as the morning had heated up, he'd found a small four-door Nissan, and they'd been traveling in air-conditioned comfort for the last hour. "Thanks for making me breakfast," Emily remarked. Since they'd been in someone else's apartment, he was left to the mercy of whatever was in the pantry. His first choice was the frozen waffles he'd found in the freezer, but the idea was crushed since the power had gone out overnight. His backup plan was the family-sized box of Tot Pops cereal. The milk was still cold inside the darkened refrigerator, so he'd poured a bowl for them both. "If the power is going out for good, it may be some time before we have milk and cereal again," he said from behind the wheel. "That sucks." After a short pause, she continued, "Why do you think the power went out when it did? I thought nuclear power plants would go on forever." He tilted his head toward her, not sure if she was being serious. If his sister had said such a thing, a woman who wouldn't know the difference between a coal power plant and a nuclear one, he wouldn't think anything of it. However, Emily was probably the President of the United States. She should know the answer to simple questions like that. Emily smiled as if she'd heard him thinking. "What I mean is, nuclear power should have lasted longer than 48 hours. A coal plant would shut down as soon as the coal stopped feeding in, say a matter of hours. As far as I know, New York never got its proposed Long Island wind farm up and running. That means the power going to the television last night was from a nuclear source. I want to know why it shut down overnight." He guided the stolen car on the two-lane road, always mindful of the derelict vehicles blocking the lanes. For a few seconds, he thought of his sister again. Silly, ditzy Rebecca. He'd watched her neighborhood burn last night. Conceptually, he knew everyone in America was probably gone, but also, knowing he'd never hear his sister's laugh again, killed him inside. "Well, Madam President, I'm impressed. You seem to know quite a bit about power generation on the East Coast, including the status of yet-to-be-built wind farms in these parts." "And?" she replied. "And the answer is, I have no idea why we lost power. Maybe a tree branch fell on a wire. Didn't that knock out power for the whole East Coast a few years ago? Or maybe the assholes leading this shit show went out and turned things off. If I were in charge, I'd want to conserve as many resources as I could, rather than waste running televisions inside empty apartments." Emily seemed to think on it, and it made him reflective, too. Who were the people invading America? He'd watched the broadcast by Jaden Phillips, or David as he called himself now, but that only gave him the face of the beast. There had to be millions of people behind him. Those arriving planes didn't appear out of thin air. They had to be waiting for the precise moment of the attack in order to get there so fast. Same with the ships. How did they get into port immediately after the attack? For all he and Emily had discovered, the enemy still had no name, no base of operations, no place where America could point a finger and fight back. He and Emily had surmised Jaden was currently in Colorado at NORAD, but even that was a guess. The extent of his battlefield intelligence was Newark being overrun. New York was getting there, and the only good guys around were on a ship over the horizon. They were silent for the bulk of the ride toward the end of Long Island. The forest-lined road was flat most of the way, but they'd gone over a gentle hill before coming to a small tourist town stuffed with cars. "Okay, we're here," Emily said with excitement. "This is Montauk." "It looks like we've driven into Disney World with all this traffic." The area was quaint, with tasteful motels and tourist storefronts, but his focus was entirely on the vehicles as he drove around several pile-ups. "We have to decide if we're going out by sea or air." She pointed to an upcoming roundabout. "Left is the marina. Right will take us around the lake to the airport." Ted drove along the shoulder, then went on to the grass inside the giant traffic circle. Based on how the cars were parked, there'd been a traffic jam taking place at the moment America was attacked. Going into the middle was the best way to avoid it. The delay gave him time to think, but he still wasn't sure what to do. Emily spoke up when he didn't say anything. "I say we get on a plane and go find your niece. I know that's what you want to do." Ted gripped the wheel. It was, in fact, what he'd been thinking. How did she already know him so well? However, it wasn't the professional thing to do. "No, if you have a seaworthy boat, we'll escape Long Island and head north. We should be able to hug the coast, avoid our overhead friends, and put some distance from the men looking for us. Once we get far enough north, we can hop into a plane and go west." She grimaced. "You still want to take on NORAD all by yourself? You know I could be wrong about the broadcast coming from a replica of the Oval Office. It might not have come from NORAD at all. Maybe there's a duplicate somewhere else made just for this invasion. Ted, that's not out of the realm of possibility for someone who can destroy our whole country in only a few minutes." The next choice he made could mean life or death for lots of people. Chicago, Illinois. Tabby stood on the elevator as she came up from the Bon Terre mine. The clanking and herky-jerky of the 100-year-old lift was somehow comforting, despite the threat of it falling apart under her feet. The cage doors opened, and Mom and Dad stood there, with scowls on their faces. "What?" she asked with surprise. Mom tapped her foot in an ageless sign of maternal impatience. "Did you forget something, young lady?" Dad craned his neck to look behind her. She turned around, but the elevator was empty. "Where'd they go?" Tabby asked with confusion. "You left your people, Tabitha. What's the first rule I taught you down there?" Her shoulders slumped. "Always come back with the same number of tourists you left with." "And how many did you lose?" Dad spoke with more anger than concern, which was totally unlike him. She glanced all around the large elevator, hoping someone was hiding. That took about 2 seconds, leading her to an answer she couldn't avoid. "How many?" Dad repeated. "I've lost all 3!" she yelled out loud, as someone jostled her shoulder. "Tabby, are you all right?" A young teen boy knelt next to her. He wore a blue tracksuit with red sneakers, as if fully prepared to start soccer practice. "Donovan?" Her eyes darted around the observation deck of the Sears Tower, and it all rushed back. They'd come there last night after a long day on the road trying to reach Mom and Dad at the edge of the disaster. However, after almost 2 days of hoping and praying, she'd come to the conclusion they were dead, like everyone else. Her heart skipped a few beats, then seemed to have trouble regaining its rhythm. Much like in her dreams, she had a cosmic revelation. It wasn't the 3 teens who were gone forever. It was her parents. "Dang it. I didn't want to wake up from my dream." She sat up on the small padded bench. "I'm sorry," Donovan drawled, "but you're going to want to see this." He stood up and motioned for her to follow him to a corner. "Just peek around." When she got there, she saw a scene that might have been from her nightmare. Audrey and Peter were on the floor together behind another bench, about 20 feet away. The suspicious side of her wondered if they'd slept there all night, though it didn't look very comfortable. However they got there, they couldn't move from behind it, or they'd be seen by the investigative white robot floating outside the window. "How long has it been there?" she whispered. Donovan took a quick peek around the corner, then leaned closer. "I don't know. Pete caught my attention. He woke me up. When I came around the bend, I saw it and where it had them." She held her bangs to keep them from giving her away. Then she looked around the corner again. "It must know we're here. It isn't moving. Maybe it sent for backup," he suggested. Tabby crouched against the wall. "Hey, Audrey! Peter! Can you hear me?" "Yes!" Peter gushed. "What should we do? This thing won't go away!" Quieter, he added, "It must have seen us." She thought back to her dream about getting out of that elevator and seeing Mom and Dad. It seemed so real, and it still lingered in her memory as if it was. It might be the last connection she ever had with them. She put herself back in the dream, desperate to ask Dad what she should do. He always had the answer, no matter the question. How did he do that? "Tabby?" Donovan sounded worried. "We've got to help them." "I know." There wasn't much she could do about the drone outside, but she could get her people on the move. Keep the tour on schedule. She knew how to push these kids. "Guys," she called out to Audrey and Peter. "On 3, I want you to run to me. We're getting out of here before more of those things arrive. Get your stuff ready." She stood up again, content she was making the right call. There was no point in waiting if they'd already been spotted. Escaping the building was the priority. "We're ready!" Audrey exclaimed. 1, 2, 3! Tabby peered around the corner, unafraid to be seen. The hovering drone seemed to fight against the wind, but otherwise didn't leave its position. The black orb underneath was undoubtedly a camera. By the time she'd finished studying the drone, Peter and Audrey came rushing around the corner, hand in hand. She waved her arm. "The elevator! Go!" she ordered. The clock was ticking. The drone operator would report movement, more would be sent, and eventually people would show up to capture them. Or worse. "We have to hurry," she said, with as even a voice as she could muster. Her heart raced beyond her lung capacity, making her take short, uneven breaths. However, she did everything possible to hide her fear. Peter pressed the button over and over, but seemed agitated immediately. When he punched the button with his knuckles, she gently shoved him aside. "What's up?" He pointed. "The light isn't coming on." "Shit," she said quietly. "The power's out." There were no lights on in the observation area, but the bright morning sunshine made interior lights unnecessary. If the power was out in the building, the elevators would be out too. "The stairs!" she said, in a high-pitched voice. No one remarked on her obvious panic. They went a few paces to the right and opened the fire door to the stairwell. She noticed a knocking sound, a little like a jackhammer, followed by the crash of glass. It couldn't be coincidence that it seemed to come from around the corner where the drone had been stationed. "Go! Hurry!" They all went in. She slammed the door and took a deep breath. The 3 kids stood on the landing with her, as if afraid of starting down 103 floors and an untold number of steps. "What are you waiting for?" She expected a drone to tap on the door at any second. Like any good science fiction movie, it probably had heat-seeking equipment to see her standing against the cold metal slab. Tabby took the lead and went down the first flight. The kids soon followed. Donovan caught up to her and went ahead, 2 steps at a time, which she didn't mind. He was the sports guy in their group and probably wanted to show off. Peter was the heavy-set kid. He and Audrey lagged behind. After 5 minutes, her calves burned. A short time later, Peter lodged the first complaint. "I have to stop," he chuffed, nearly out of breath. The boy did have a few extra pounds, but didn't look unhealthy. "He wants to stop for his girlfriend," Donovan taunted from a flight below. He kept one hand on his pistol as it sat securely in his police utility belt. "No, I don't," Peter replied in a leave-me-alone sing-song. "I'm not stopping," Audrey interrupted, continuing down the seemingly endless steps. "I can make it." After another 10 minutes of continuous motion, Tabby wondered if she should make them stop for their own good. Her legs were aching, and her calves felt like they were actually on fire. How were the kids keeping up? "We're almost there!" Donovan shouted. Tabby glanced wearily at the plaque, noting the floor number. They were still on the 20th floor. It didn't feel close to the end. She decided to let the athletic boy lead. If no one else was going to halt, neither was she. At 10 floors to go, she had to wobble from flight to flight. Her legs were jelly. At 2 floors to go, she leaned heavily on the railing to compensate for her pain. Peter and Audrey lagged a few floors above her, though she saw their hands coming down the railing when she looked up the narrow gap to the floors above. "We're there!" Donovan shouted. She barely heard him over her own footfalls. Each plodding step brought her closer to the end, and she could finally taste it through the pain. At the same time, she couldn't portray too much weakness, though the struggle made it seem as if she was dying a little inside. Faking positivity was high on her mind as she rounded the last landing and saw Donovan holding the door at the bottom. "See, we made it," he said, breathing heavily. "Yeah, she started to say. Bursts of red exploded from his chest, followed by the echo of muffled gunshots. She caught herself on the banister to stop, though her sweaty palms made her trip down an extra step or two. Leaning forward, she was not more than 20 feet away from her young friend. Donovan looked right at her with eyes that said, "Tabby, help me." Then he crumpled against the door, dead. The shadow of a walking horse drone appeared in the doorway. Chapter 2. USS John F. Kennedy, south of New York City. Meacham led Kyla deep into the belly of the aircraft carrier, one ladder at a time. The trip through the claustrophobic interior reminded her a lot of the day before, minus the shooting. Most of the empty uniforms were gone, too. Van Nuys had asked the remaining crew to spend every free moment gathering them into piles out of respect for the deceased. They'd all worked on that until near midnight. "Where are we going?" Kyla asked for the 3rd time. Meacham had practically pulled her out of the rack, where she'd spent an uncomfortable night of sleep. The hasty wake-up didn't seem normal, even for the dialed-to-11 young female Marine, so Kyla remained vigilant for trouble. She'd kept Carthager's M9 semi-automatic Beretta pistol in her waistband. It made her feel a little like one of those gangster rappers, but it fit snug and stayed in place, aided by the few extra pounds she could never lose around her midsection. "We're here," the short-haired woman replied, while pointing to an open doorway. The Marine went in without further comment, and Kyla followed, like she wasn't quite sure this wasn't a setup. A man spoke up. "Over here." "Sergeant Carthager?" she replied in a low voice, though no one else was around. "Take a seat," he ordered. She did as requested, mostly because it seemed like she was in a spy movie. She'd been brought all the way down here to talk to a guy who had passed her in the hallways multiple times over the last couple of days. Why he needed her to sneak around to meet him was unknown. He got right to it. "Listen, we heard what you told the captain yesterday, that it was your uncle down there and the VP was with him. Are you absolutely sure it was the both of them?" "I bet my life on it. I even texted my uncle on the flight out to confirm." "But was it her? You have to be 100% sure." Yesterday, she'd had her doubts, but lying in bed gave her plenty of time to reflect on it. The pinned-up hairstyle matched the vice president's. Same color hair, too. She was about the right height and figure from Kyla's recollection from television. Back when her ticket was voted into office, you couldn't look at a screen without seeing the first female vice president. Uncle Ted's mission was to fly her plane, so it stood to reason he'd die trying to keep her alive. "I'm 100%, sir." Carthager nodded seriously. "Good. I like to see confidence like that." He passed a look to Meacham, and she took a few steps back before he continued. "Meach and I have talked about this at length, and I don't see any other way. We have to bring you in on part of our mission. Someone has to get a message to the vice president." Kyla chuckled. "Is that why you brought me down here with all this cloak and dagger stuff? I can give you my phone. My uncle and I communicated just yesterday." "No, that won't work. We're going to use this." He pointed to a radio sitting on a nearby shelf. "Why? What's going on?" Carthager put one boot on an empty metal chair and peered down at her. "Ma'am, we came on this ship because someone up the chain of command got wind a big event was about to go down. Obviously, that something kicked off before we could report back, but our fast platoon has been doing its homework over the past 24 hours. We now know 2 things. 1, we can't trust a damn person on this ship. 2, we have to get a message to the vice president, or more people are going to die." "Why? Why are they going to die?" she asked. "I'm afraid I can't tell you that," he continued before she could protest. "But it isn't because I don't trust you. If you're captured, they could pry it from you. You gotta trust me on this. The enemy is on the ship, and it could be anyone." "Even the captain?" she asked lamely. "Anyone," he said dryly. She sat there for a few moments, then peered at the radio. "What do you want me to say to him?" Carthager rubbed his chin, then motioned for Meacham to go to the radio. Kyla was surprised how much non-verbal communication passed between the 2 Marines. "We need to know where he is, but you can't use place names. There will almost certainly be unfriendly ears listening." Since she had no realistic idea where he was, it was hard to envision a place she could tell him to go. The last place she'd seen him was in Central Park over 12 hours ago. They could be in Canada by now. The leader went on. "Once we get him online, I'll explain how we're going to do this." Meacham invited her to sit at the radio. She watched as the woman adjusted the frequencies and asked her to call out for her uncle. The first lesson was to use a name only he would recognize, so she had to think it over for a minute or 2. "I hope he remembers this. This is Reba calling for Haley Boo. Do you have your ears on?" Reba was shorthand for Rebecca, which was Mom's name, but the nickname also happened to be one of her mother's favorite singers. It was one of Mom's many contrasts, the hippy-dippy mother wearing tie-dye dresses, singing country songs. Haley Boo was the name of one of Uncle Ted's girlfriends. The boo was because the woman was terrified beyond logic by ghosts. Meacham smiled approvingly at her use of the handles. After repeating the call-out a few times, they went to a new frequency. For the next 15 minutes, they went through the routine until a reply came. "This is Haley Boo. Go ahead, Reba." Carthager leaned close. "It's a Marine frequency. He might be on a boat or using a boat's radio. Tell him you're having a birthday party and need to give him a present." Kyla did as instructed. Uncle Ted seemed to understand she was talking in code. Her uncle's voice crackled in the radio. "I've got a few things going on, but I think a birthday party sounds nice." Carthager whispered, "See if you can dial in where he is. Pick a place only he would know, then ask him how many miles he is from it." She tried to think, but there was only one spot on her mind. "Haley Boo, do you remember where we've always had birthday parties in the past? How many miles are you from there?" They waited a few seconds before the reply came back. "We're about 100 miles from those birthday parties. We're also about 60 miles from the place where Haley Boo's mother and I took you on your 10th birthday." Kyla grinned and spoke quietly to the Marines. "That's Martha's Vineyard. It was a big deal because Uncle Ted knew someone in the government who gave us a tour." Carthager tapped his temple. It's an island, right? We can draw a circle around it and see where it meets the circle around the other place. Where was the first location? New York City. Pelham Bay, to be exact. My mom's house. We always invited Uncle Ted to my parties. She got a little sad at the memory, though the tough guy Marine kept talking. Right, so he's 100 from New York, but only 60 from Martha's. Any idea where that might be? No, she replied. But you said he was on a marine band and might be on a boat. That gives me an idea. Haley Boo, the birthday party you mentioned. You aren't by chance using the same type of transportation as we used that day, are you? To the Marines in the room, she added, We took a ferry from New York out to Martha's Vineyard. It took all day and was the most boring part of the trip by far. We are, Reba. In fact, we're a little more than halfway on the same route if we were going to your 10th birthday party again. I don't think you'd like how boring it is out here. Yep, she deadpanned to those around her. He's on a boat. Carthager let out a sigh of relief. He's still alive and on the move. That's excellent. High marks for your uncle. Now, are there any other places you've had birthday parties where we might be able to get to him? She had a place in mind right away. It wasn't a birthday party, but I did take a field trip he would know about. It was to a lighthouse. Off the coast of Long Island, New York. This is wonderful, Emily said excitedly. Your niece is alive, and it would seem quite the fighter. Emily's family yacht rocked with the waves. They'd stopped and shut off the motors so no one on the radio would figure out they were on the water. Now, he didn't want Emily to start it back up until he'd had some time to think it over. Yeah, she's the rebel of the family. Her mom was a pushover. She'd spend an hour to get a fly to exit through the door rather than swat it dead. Up until the last few days, I'd have thought Kyla was cut from the same material. Now I've seen her on a helicopter leaving a war zone, and she's using coded messages on the radio. I'm impressed, but also worried what she's gotten herself into. Don't you trust what she said? This rendezvous at the lighthouse? Using coded words only the two of them would understand, they'd agreed to meet at the Montauk Lighthouse, which was at the easternmost point of Long Island. She'd gone there on a field trip in middle school, and he remembered it because Rebecca called him the night before, asking if it was safe to let her go. Now, there was no question it wasn't safe. He looked south toward shore. The skies were overcast, but the thin slice of Long Island was still visible. He couldn't make out the lighthouse, but it was there. I trust her, but she was being coached. I'm wondering who was there with her. How could you tell? Ted had spent enough years in the Air Force to know tones of voice while on the radio. Kyla was nervous and cautious and spoke in monotone, as if reading from a script or repeating what was told to her. I've known her since she was a baby. As much as I'm impressed with her coding, she couldn't have come up with it on her own. She couldn't have found us on this maritime frequency, not unless she's been taking a lot of classes down at the Learning Annex I don't know about. He smirked to Emily to offload some of his tension. So we really can't trust her, but we have to go anyway, right? There was no way he could skip on a chance to collect her. If she was with him, he could get Emily and his niece to safety in Canada. That would be a job well done by anyone's measure. He knew what he wanted to do, but she was the president. You're driving. What are your orders? It was her family's boat, and she'd driven it before with her husband, so he was content to let her pilot the 50-foot giant. He stood next to her as she thought about the answer. However, he'd gotten to know her very well over the past 2 days. Much as he'd done with his friend Frank, he would eat his hat if Emily suggested they leave his niece behind. She didn't disappoint. Let's go see that lighthouse. San Francisco, California. Dwight woke up with the feeling of a shoe in his side. Living on the streets for so many years, he'd become accustomed to the unpleasant wake.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?